Hi, my name is Matt Congrove. I'm a senior developer for X-Plane, and I run a studio called Airport Tech. I've done a couple of payware airports so far, Austin, Texas, and LaGuardia 2020. And when I'm developing these sceneries, I'm usually streaming on Twitch every couple of days, and I'll show how you create models in SketchUp and how you can texture those models in SketchUp, and then how you put them in X-Plane along with some other items in World Editor, and then how to do orthoimagery and all sorts of stuff, basically running the whole gamut of scenery development. But the one thing that people always ask me again and again is to show them how to texture the models in SketchUp. So that's what we'll be going over here today. And if you ever do have a scenery development question, be sure to check out the Twitch stream. I'll link it in the description below. Always happy to answer questions from anyone that pops in. So the first thing to discuss is how you're going to lay out your texture. So the most important aspect when it comes to X-Plane textures is the dimensions or the resolution of the image that you're using. Now there's a couple of rules here. The first rule is that the image has to be in the dimensions of power of 2. Now power of 2, the easiest way to think of that is your RAM size or your hard drive size. A power of 2 would be 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096, and on and on and on. Now, what that means is that if you look here in Photoshop, I've got this image, and it's 1024 by 1024. Okay? Any of those power of 2 values can work here, up to 4096. That is the maximum you can go. So we can do a 4096 by a 4096. That is our maximum resolution for X-Plane. Now, they don't have to be the same. We can have 1024 by 2048 or 512 by 4096. It doesn't really matter as long as the width and the height are one of those power of 2 values. So now that we've got the resolution set, we need to start thinking about all the different textures we're going to have in our model. Now over here I've got the finished model, but when you're starting your texturing, usually at this point, it looks something more along these lines, right? So you need to start thinking ahead of all the different textures that you want to use. I use textures.com. That's where I get most of my textures from. And you want to list them out, and you want to pull them all into Photoshop, into a file. And what you want to do is you want to start thinking about how these are actually going to fit on the building. So for instance, we have this glass here, right? Now obviously this glass is going to flow along the outside of this building. It's all the same height, all these walls are the same height, and they just go on infinitely around this building in this horizontal axis, right? So what we can think about is when we're doing this in Photoshop in this situation, you can use paint.net or whatever works best for you, but in our image editor, because this is going to wrap around the building infinitely along that horizontal axis, we want to make sure that in in Photoshop, our image actually goes from one end to the other of the image along that horizontal plane. So all the way from the left side to all the way to the right side. And what that's going to allow us to do is we can actually tile this image. So we'll use this bit of the image for this wall. And then we'll take that same part and we'll put it over here. And it will just kind of wrap this building along that horizontal plane. And you'll kind of see as we get a little bit further along. But you just need to remember that whenever you go from edge to edge, SketchUp will tile in that direction. So in this situation, left to right. You could also do texture that goes up and down, and SketchUp will texture infinitely along that plane as well. So one of the things that I always recommend, and in this situation I'm actually not doing it because I've kind of thought about this long and hard, and I've been doing this long enough. My recommendation is to always leave some empty space at the bottom of your image, and this is really important when you're first working with textures in SketchUp, because there's always a situation, it seems, where you come back and you go, oh no, I forgot I needed to add that one texture. I forgot I needed a texture for that door or for that window or whatever it may be. And if your texture is full, like this one is, you only have a couple options. Number one, you can put your new door texture on top of something. You can put it down here and end up covering something that you didn't really want to cover, right? And then you have to go and you have to fix all the areas that you've textured that way in SketchUp. Or the other thing you have to do is you have to increase your image dimension, right? So you're going to have to go, okay, well, now I got to increase this to 2048. And now you have the extra room down here, but the problem is over here in SketchUp, all of the points that you've been using and saying, you know, I want this part of the texture here and this part over there, it's all gone. You have to completely start over. So I always recommend that, especially for people that are new to this, give yourself some extra room with your textures. So give yourself the space so that later on you can come in, you can say, oh, I need to add something in here, and it's not going to screw up all the work that you've put in so far. Alright, so now let's talk about how we actually get the texture from Photoshop over into SketchUp. So obviously we just want to save this image down. We're going to save it as a PNG file, not a JPEG. We want to save it as a PNG file for now. Later on we'll convert it over to a DDS file because that's what Xplane prefers, but for now, PNG. Now the way I do this is I have this Fairy Terminal SketchUp file, and this is what my object is named. It's Fairy Terminal.object. So I went ahead and I named the texture for this Fairy Terminal.psd for the Photoshop and PNG for the PNG because, well, it's easy to associate this with that when it's all named the same. I do have some that doesn't work for. I have a generic texture that I use for a lot of smaller things, and so it's just called generic. But when you have something that's specific to a model, try and name it the same, and make sure that your file names are something simple. No spaces, no strange characters like asterisks or parentheses or anything like that. Try and limit it to alphanumeric, A through Z, 0 through 9, no spaces, none of that, because along the way you'll have different programs complain about file names like that, so keep it simple. Now what we can do over here, ignore that little bit, is you open up the window menu and go to your default tray and then open this materials pane, and you'll see over here we've got this materials pane. Now when it first loads up, it's going to load up like this probably, but you want to click the drop down and select in model, and this shows you all the textures that are in your model. Now when you first load up when you first load up SketchUp, you might have a couple already in there, you know, like solid colors like a red or a yellow or something. You can ignore those for the time being, but you want to make sure that you're looking at this end model because it shows you everything that's being used by what you're working on. So we're going to click this little plus button. It's for creating the material. We're going to create a material by clicking on this browse and selecting our Fairy Terminal.png file that we have here. We're going to open and press OK. And now we have this material that we can paint with, and it's this image that we have over here. So let's go ahead and look at this a bit more closely. So what we're going to do is we're going to select our paint bucket tool. You can click on the icon up here, or you can click the B button, as in Bravo, and that will also give you your paint bucket. What you want to do then is you want to select the material by clicking on it over here in your materials, and then you can click and paint, and you can start applying this texture all over the place, except there's one problem. If you notice, it's really, really small. So we're going to undo all this, and we're going to keep our one painted texture. Okay. Now what we want to do is we want to obviously scale this and perhaps rotate and adjust the position of this. So what you do is you right click on the face, texture, position, and you'll see they get these 4 little pins. Now these 4 pins are telling SketchUp what part of the texture to use. Now there are a couple of ways of doing the selection process. A lot of people like to hold the shift button, and you can see here you can actually kind of rotate and skew and scale and things like that, but I think that's really kind of annoying. So I like to not use that shift. I like to just keep the pin simple. And what you want to do is you want to click on this pin down here. As you notice, the top left, top right, those pins are fine, right? They're on the part of the texture that we want. So we'll grab the bottom left pin because we're just trying to get the glass. We'll click on it and we'll drop it over here by clicking. Now you might notice that it snaps into place. So there is some snapping along the corners of the texture, as well as along the midpoint of the texture. So we'll snap to the middle along this edge, and we'll click to drop it. We'll do the same for the one on the right. Click to pick it up, let it snap, click to drop it. Now we'll zoom back out here, and you'll see that we have to quite clearly scale this up a bit. Now the key here, and people make this mistake a lot, is they'll just start dragging off like this, right? Okay. Well, now your material is kind of wonky, right? We don't really want to do that. Now we're fortunate here because we have a rectangular face, so we can just drag these pins and snap them into the locations that we want them to go, right? Because we want to keep them nice and aligned, and we're moving them to a rectangular face, so that works out well. But if you have a circular face or some face that's not just a rectangular or a square, the way I like to do it is I like to move one pair of these at a time, okay, along the same plane. So you see here now, okay, I'll take this one over here and move it to the right. Then I'll take this one and move it to the right. And I'll take this one and move it down. And then this one, move it down. And because it gives us this guide, you can see it's telling us where the square is off of this one and this one. If you always do them in pairs, like this, along the same axis, you will never have the problem of your SketchUp texture looking like this and then having to start over, which can happen quite often. But again, if you have a square or a rectangular surface like we do here, don't need to worry about it too much. But it's still a best practice. Now, you might notice that the texture is skewed a bit, right? It's stretched out horizontally. The windows are a little fat. So we're going to pull this in. I'm just going to pull it to the halfway mark because it's nice and simple that way. There's our halfway point. Pull this one in too. There we go. Our windows are a bit better now. And you'll see that this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, where this window texture, or part of the texture, will continue to scale, rather tile infinitely. So we're gonna press Enter to lock in what we have. And with our paint bucket, we're gonna hold the Alt key samples. So we hold Alt and click, and we've just sampled that section. And because that infinitely tiles horizontally, we can go click here, here, and here, and here, and here. And there you go. Most of this building is already done because we were careful with how we position this texture to make sure that it's going to scale and wrap around nicely. Right? Now we also took care to do that with the rest of the image as well, including this bitumen and the gravel, right? So let's kind of dive in and see how that works. Now we have a couple options. We can sample here and paste it up here. That's fine, or we can just go click on our material again. We can paste that up here. In this situation, you do have to go back through and kind of rework all this, which is fine because you're doing a totally new section. So we'll snap to the midpoints again. We'll have to zoom in a little bit. Get a little bit closer, and we'll move this one by hand. We will have snapping along the edge here, but we won't have a snap between the gravel and the bitumen, so we have to hand place that. But now we will get snapping to the one that we just dropped. And there we go. So we have a nice rectangular area again. And obviously we need to rotate this. So right click, rotate 90 degrees. And again, we'll kind of pull this out. Try and keep it, well, try and keep it snapped. There we go. Sometimes you have to go in small increments and do it a little slowly to make sure that you stay square to everything. But again, in this situation, fortunately, we're going to a rectangle, so we can kind of ignore that a little bit. We'll just pull it out here to the corners. Sometimes SketchUp will not let you over-rotate, and you will have to sort of do it piecemeal like that. Alright, again, we've got this bitumen down, but it's stretched, so we'll pull it back to the halfway mark. We could do it anywhere we want it, but it makes sense to go halfway, nice and easy. And from here we have a couple options. So we can sample, you can click, and as you can see, it's just going to continue working its way up that tile, the texture, right? So we're gonna, if we kept doing that, the next, as you can see, would be glass, because we're kind of painting with that texture, right? And we don't want that, so right-click, texture position. Oop, texture position. A couple options, so we can drag it over by hand. But this is not very precise, okay? And also, if you have something that you're trying to line up, so for instance here, you're going to lose that alignment because you're doing this by hand. Instead, what you want to do, I want to do that real fast. If you want to do it the quick and easy way, texture position, you can hold the shift key and then use your arrow keys. and it'll do these nice big jumps. And if you let go of the shift key, you can actually get a bit more fine movement out of it. Get it right where you want it, and press enter. There you go. You just move the texture over. Another way, of course, is to select the texture. We'll use our move tool, and we'll hold Control to get into the copy mode. Click, paste, and there you go. That works, right? Another option for a situation like this is we'll again just copy, paste. Now the nice thing is we can go back to our sample tool. So I'll press B for the bucket and sample the paint here, and paste it over here. I can get rid of that line. And also, while we're here, if you look, this texture is on the same line as this face over here, right? So we'll sample, paste, sample, paste. Right? So as you can see, texturing can be quite quick if you get your texture image set up the right way at first. You can really save yourself a lot of time by thinking through the best way to line this stuff up and making sure that you have room to come back and make changes later, and things like that. Now, what are some common issues that I see people run into? Well, aside from the ones that we've already kind of covered, such as image size and things like that, is I often see that a lot of people have 20 or 30 different versions of this material over here in the side. I'm not sure really how that happens, but you know, I can kind of sloppily recreate that by just going back through my initial workflow of clicking the add texture, and maybe that's how people do it. But now in this situation, you can see I have a lot of these same materials in here. Now this isn't going to work because as far as Photoshop, as far as Xplane is concerned at this point, it's going to think that you have multiple textures for this one model, and you can't do that. You can only have one texture per model. So what we need to do is we need to go in here and we need to start deleting these. So right click, delete, yes. And unfortunately, yes, you do have to do them one by one. Now, let's say that you run into the situation where you've changed a file name, and maybe that's why you've kind of got this, these additional textures and their additional materials. If you click on a material and you go to the Edit tab, you can actually come back here and you can go back to that Browse, and you can reselect your image. All right. So if we wanted to, we could actually, let's say, if we hide this texture, and then we'll resave this as a PNG, and we'll call it Fairy Terminal 2. We'll save it. Let's say we wanted to swap this out. Well, again, we go into our in model section of the materials, click on the material that we want, edit, go back to our browse, find our new PNG, and open. And if we go back and look, you'll see that we are now using our new material. Alright, so now that we've sort of gone over how to texture your model in SketchUp, obviously now we need to talk about how to get it into Xplane. So the first thing we want to do is we want to go to File and Export Xplane Object. Now this is the wonderful plugin by Jonathan Harris, also known as Marginal, called SketchUp to Xplane. Hopefully you've already downloaded this. It's quite impossible to get anything from SketchUp into Xplane without it, so you're definitely going to need it. So we'll click it, and we have some information here. So the first is a little tidbit of info that was kind of key for Xplane scenery design, which is it wrote 190 triangles. Now 190 triangles is fine. That's the number of triangles that make up this model, right? For building this size, somewhere around 200 is perfectly acceptable. Now if this said it wrote 10,000 triangles to the object, there's a concern there, because for each triangle, that's something that has to be drawn in Xplane, right? And it's GPU intensive. So if you have dozens of buildings that are 10,000 triangles apiece, you're really going to be hurting the performance of Xplane. So that's one thing to always kind of keep an eye on. You eventually over time will start building up the idea of, well, building this big is about 200 triangles, building this big is about 500 triangles. When I do an air traffic control tower, especially because they're usually sort of round, which is a lot of triangles, maybe it's 2,000 triangles or something like that. But you should always try and keep the number of triangles to a minimum. Now the other information that we have here is we have a warning. and then a prompt. It says 63 faces are untextured. Do you want to highlight these untextured faces? Now if you click yes, what it's going to do is these white areas that we haven't actually textured yet, it's going to texture them for us with a nice bright red color, so that we know that this area hasn't been textured yet. It's really handy when you're trying to paint, with a white texture, and SketchUp is by default white surface. You can often miss a surface or two sometimes, so it's handy to have that red color. But you want to make sure that you don't have this on when you export, obviously. So after you've gone through and you have copied everything over and gotten rid of these faces, you might want to just right click over here back in your materials and delete these as well. So get rid of all these new textures that the plugin gave us, and just make sure that, again, we only have that one material. Alright, so off camera I went ahead and finished filling in all the different areas that we hadn't textured, and so now we should be good to go. So we're going to do File, Export X-Plane Object again, and as you can see we got rid of our warning, and now it just tells us that we wrote about 200 triangles to the object. So we're good to go. We're going to press OK, and now we should have fairyterminal.obj, which we can then, of course, go into World Editor, our X-Plane scenery development tool, and place our object. I hope that answers some questions for you about how to texture SketchUp models specifically for X-Plane. If you have any additional questions, be sure to leave a comment below, or come check out the Twitch stream that I put on every couple of days that focuses on scenery design development. Ask any questions. I'm always more than happy to help people out and show people how to do things while I'm streaming. It's not a bother at all. I'm more than happy to share that with people. So the link to my Twitch stream will be down in the description. Come check it out sometime. Drop by, say hello, and hope to see you all again soon.